The year was 1886, and mornings in Ashton Hill, Missouri Township began not with church bells or rooster calls, but with the soft hum of an oven fire and the smell of warm bread floating through the streets. Children walking to the one-room schoolhouse would pause, eyes half closed, breathing in that comforting scent. Even the blacksmith, gruff old Mr. Calder, admitted that Elias Boone's bread made the whole town smell like home. Elias's bakery was small, barely 2 windows wide, with a sign hand-carved by his late wife, Boone's Hearth and Loaf. The paint had faded, but the heart carved beside the lettering still shone through the dust. Inside, Elias worked quietly. He moved like a man who had lived the same rhythm for years, mixing, kneading, baking. But there was gentleness in every motion, as though he wasn't merely making food. He was remembering someone. When the townsfolk asked why his bread tasted unlike any other, Elias only smiled faintly and said, "Because I bake with memory, not just flour." Elias Boone was a widower. 3 winters ago, pneumonia had taken his wife Clara, leaving him alone in their modest home behind the bakery. She had been his laughter, his reason for singing as he worked, his partner in kneading and dreaming. Now, the only sound that filled the space was the steady crackle of wood and the soft thump of dough against his work table. Every morning before sunrise, Elias would whisper the same words, "Good morning, Clara. Let's make something warm for the world again." He still used her recipes, written in her looping, graceful hand, smudged with flour fingerprints from years ago. She had always believed bread carried more than taste. It carried care. And though Elias rarely spoke much to anyone, every loaf that left his oven carried something silent yet powerful, his heart. It was a cold morning in early February when something unusual happened. Elias was kneading his second batch of rye dough when he noticed strange lines forming in the surface. At first, he thought it was just the stretch of gluten, but as the dough swelled beneath his hands, faint letters began to appear, curves and loops that seemed almost deliberate. He leaned closer. Uh, and, and, um, Elias froze. That was the name of little Anna Whitmore, the 8-year-old girl who came every Wednesday for honey rolls. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and shook his head. Maybe it was the early hour playing tricks on him. Still, something about it sent a chill down his spine. He baked the loaf anyway, but when it came out of the oven, the faint letters were still there, baked golden into the crust. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, Mrs. Whitmore, Anna's mother, came into the shop looking pale and weary. "Mr. Boone," she said softly, "Anna's taken ill. Fever, the doctor says. She keeps asking for your rolls. Says they taste like her grandma's hugs." Elias swallowed hard. "She'll be all right," he murmured, handing her a warm loaf from the shelf. "Give her this. No charge." After she left, Elias stood staring at the counter, heart pounding. He turned to the cooling rack where that first loaf sat, the one with Anna's name burned faintly into it. Had the bread known? It seemed impossible. But deep down, something inside him stirred. A warmth, or maybe a warning. That night, sleep refused to come. Elias sat by candlelight, going through Clara's old recipe book for the 100th time. The ink was faded, the pages brittle, but at the bottom of one page, beneath her recipe for honey butter loaf, he noticed a line written in smaller script, almost hidden. "Love remembers, even when hands forget." He touched the words gently, as though touching her. "Clara," he whispered, "what did you mean by that?" He thought of how she used to hum while baking, how she'd tell him that every loaf held a piece of whoever made it. Maybe this wasn't superstition after all. Maybe the bread really remembered something, or someone. He looked toward the oven's soft glow. For the first time in years, Elias felt a strange kind of hope. At dawn, Elias tried something different. He prepared 2 loaves, one the usual way, and one while whispering softly under his breath. "If this is real," he said to the dough, "then let love do what it will." He thought of Harold Whitmore, Anna's grandfather, a kind man who'd lost his wife last summer and came by often for company. When the second loaf rose, Elias's breath caught. The dough had formed the letters HAROLD in faint lines. An hour later, the bell above the door rang. Harold hobbled in with his cane. "Any fresh rye today, Elias?" Elias's heart pounded. "Just came out the oven," he said, handing him the marked loaf. "Smells like heaven," Harold chuckled. As the old man left, Elias stared at his flour-dusted hands in awe. Whatever this was, it wasn't coincidence anymore. By the week's end, the story had spread across Ashton Hill like wildfire. Old Mrs. Beadle claimed one loaf had her late husband's name on it. A farmer swore his bread bore the word hope. People whispered that Elias's bread remembered those who were hurting most, that it carried love from another world. Soon, lines began forming before sunrise. Not everyone came for food. Some came for faith, for connection, for something they couldn't explain. When Elias looked out from behind the counter at the crowd of expectant faces, he felt both humbled and frightened. He hadn't asked for this. He was just a man who missed his wife and baked with his heart. But maybe that was exactly why it worked. One afternoon, Reverend Alden, the town's pastor, paid Elias a visit. He stepped into the bakery, eyes narrowed. "Elias," he said firmly, "folks are saying your bread works miracles. They're starting to worship it more than the Lord himself." Elias looked up from the counter, flour on his beard. "I never claimed to work miracles, Reverend. I only bake." The pastor sighed. "Then tell them it's coincidence. Stop this foolishness before it gets out of hand." Elias hesitated. "Maybe it's not foolishness. Maybe it's mercy." The Reverend frowned, but when Elias offered him a loaf as a gift, he accepted reluctantly. Later that evening, the pastor returned, pale-faced and shaken. "The loaf you gave me," he said softly. "It had one word burned into it." "What word?" Elias asked. "Forgive." The Reverend's eyes glistened. "I've held anger in my heart for years. Perhaps this bread speaks truths we need to hear." One foggy morning, a thin boy with a patched jacket came to the bakery. His name was Tommy Miller, the son of a rail worker who had left months ago and never returned. Tommy stared up at Elias with wide eyes. "Sir," he said, voice trembling, "they say your bread remembers people." "Can it remember my pa?" Elias knelt beside him. "What's your father's name, son?" "Samuel Miller," Tommy whispered. Elias nodded gently. "Leave it with me." That night, he worked in silence, whispering the father's name as he needed. When the loaf finally rose, his hand shook. It bore the word "return" across the crust. Elias left it at Tommy's doorstep before dawn, wrapped in a linen cloth. 2 weeks later, the town's telegraph operator brought a message from Kansas City. Miller family, returning home. Work finished early. Tommy came running to the bakery, tears streaming down his cheeks. "He's coming home. Pa's coming home." Elias smiled, eyes misty. Then the bread did what it was meant to. After Tommy's story spread, people began leaving names written on scraps of paper at Elias's door. Some were alive, some were gone, some were simply lost in spirit. He would find piles of folded notes each morning, prayers, apologies, and forgotten hopes. Elias began baking through the nights, whispering names as though they were blessings. For Sarah, for Jacob, for peace. He never charged for these loaves. He said payment came in smiles and tears. Weeks passed, and letters began arriving from faraway towns. People wrote of miracles, illnesses easing, families reuniting, old grudges healed. Elias kept every letter in a wooden box under his counter, but when he opened it one night, he noticed something strange. Every letter smelled faintly of warm bread. He smiled faintly and whispered, "Clara, is that you again?" And somewhere deep in the quiet of the bakery, the oven's fire flickered brighter, as if answering yes. The miracle of the bakery spread beyond Ashton Hill. Travelers from neighboring towns began arriving, some carrying letters, others simply carrying pain. They wanted names baked into loaves, believing the bread could speak to heaven itself. At first, Elias welcomed them. He saw the way people's eyes softened when they found a word they needed: peace, home, faith. But then the requests grew darker. A woman begged him to bake her abusive husband's name into a loaf so he might find mercy. A man demanded one for his son, to cure him of drinking. Elias began to see words form in the dough before he even prayed. Words like sorrow, forgive me, lost. Some nights he awoke to find loaves rising in the oven on their own. He could hear faint whispers, not from outside, but from within the bread. Whispers of people he'd baked for, whispers of longing. And though the bakery was filled with the scent of heaven, Elias's heart began to feel the weight of every soul he tried to heal. One rainy evening, long after closing, there came a knock on the bakery door. When Elias opened it, a tall man stood there, soaked to the bone, coat torn from travel, eyes sharp as steel and weary as sin. "I hear you bake bread that remembers names," the man said. His voice was low, almost trembling. Elias nodded. "Sometimes it does." The stranger placed a single silver coin on the counter. "Then bake one for Elias Boone." The old baker froze. "That's my name." The man gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe it's time you remember it." Elias stared at him, heart pounding. Something about the man's voice, the ache in it, felt familiar, like hearing his own sorrow spoken aloud. Without another word, he began to bake. The stranger stood silently by the fire as Elias kneaded. The storm outside howled like the grief inside his chest. He whispered his own name into the dough, for the first time. He thought of his mistakes, the years he had buried his own heart beneath duty and sorrow. When the loaf rose, Elias pulled it from the oven and nearly dropped it. There, burned golden into the crust, were the words, "Forgive yourself." He looked up, but the stranger was gone. The door's bell still swayed gently, though no wind had touched it. For the first time since Clara's death, Elias wept openly. He sank to his knees, holding the bread as if it were a letter from God himself. And in the flicker of the oven's light, he thought he saw Clara standing there, smiling through the haze of tears. That night, Elias dreamed of her. Clara stood beside the old oven, hands dusted in flour, her hair tied with the same blue ribbon she always wore. "You kept baking for others," she said gently, "but never for yourself." He reached for her, but his fingers passed through air. "You taught me to love through this bread," he whispered. "And you did," she said softly. "Now it's time to rest, my love." When he woke before dawn, the oven was already warm, though he hadn't lit it. On the table sat a single loaf he didn't remember baking. Carved faintly into the top was the name Clara. Elias smiled through tears. The bread, it seemed, had finally remembered her. Spring came early that year. One morning, a letter arrived for Elias. Its envelope soft and worn, addressed in elegant handwriting. It was from Harold Whitmore's niece, the old man whose name had once appeared in Elias's dough. She wrote, Dear Mr. Boone, Uncle Harold passed peacefully last week. In his final days, he spoke often of you. He said your bread told him that his wife was waiting on the other side. He smiled until his last breath. Thank you for giving him peace. Elias folded the letter carefully, pressing it to his chest. Then the bread remembers heaven too, he whispered. For the first time, the burden of his gift felt lighter, not as a curse, but as a bridge between hearts. Not everyone saw the bread as a blessing. The new mayor of Ashton Hill, Charles Benton, saw only opportunity. He arrived one morning in a fine suit, flanked by businessmen. Your bread draws people from miles away, Mr. Boone, Benton said, flashing a thin smile. We can turn this into an enterprise, the bread of memory. Imagine the profit. Elias frowned. It's not for profit, sir. It's for hearts. The mayor's smile vanished. Hearts don't pay taxes. If you won't sell it, I'll close your shop for spreading superstition. Elias simply turned back to his dough. You can close my doors, he said quietly, but you can't stop the oven that remembers love. The mayor left in anger, but as he stormed out, he passed a loaf cooling on the counter. It bore one word across its crust: greed. He never mentioned the bakery again. Winter returned harsh and unforgiving. The wind moaned through the hills like a living thing. One night, as Elias worked late, a lantern slipped from his hand and shattered. Flames leapt across the wooden floor, hungry and fast. He tried to smother them, but the fire was too strong. By dawn, Boone's hearth and loaf was nothing but ash and ruin. The townsfolk gathered in silence, their beloved bakery gone. But amid the smoke and cinders, something miraculous lay untouched. A single loaf, perfectly baked, resting on a blackened stone. As they drew closer, they saw words faintly etched across it. Thank you, Elias. The old baker fell to his knees, tears streaking his soot-covered face. He held the loaf close, feeling Clara's warmth, the townspeople's love, the years of memories all rising within him. That night, under a pale Missouri moon, Elias gathered the last of his flour, borrowed from neighbors who refused to let him stop baking. He rebuilt a small fire beside the ruins of his bakery and whispered softly as he worked, for Anna, for Harold, for Tommy, for Clara. Each name was a prayer, each need a heartbeat. When the loaf was done, it bore no single name, only a message that glowed faintly in the firelight. Love never forgets. He smiled weakly. Then neither will I. He placed the loaf on the windowsill of what remained of his bakery and watched the stars flicker above, their light dancing across the crust. It was the most beautiful loaf he'd ever made. Elias Boone passed quietly that spring. They found him seated on his porch, a gentle smile on his face, and that final loaf resting beside him. The town mourned as though they had lost family. They buried him on the hill overlooking Main Street, where the morning sun touched his grave first. At his funeral, the people shared stories, not of miracles, but of kindness. How Elias gave free bread to widows. How he stayed open during snowstorms. How his hands were never too tired to comfort a crying child. A week later, the townsfolk rebuilt his bakery together. They called it Boone's Hearth Reborn. Each spring they gathered to bake a single batch of bread in his honor. And every year, one loaf would rise with a name no one had written. They called it Elias's Loaf. Decades passed. Ashton Hill changed, roads were paved, wagons gave way to cars, and the old church bell fell silent. But the scent of warm bread still filled the air each spring morning. Children would ask their elders, "Why does it smell like that, even when no one's baking?" And the elders would smile softly and say, "That's the baker's gift, the bread that remembers names." Sometimes, when the sun dipped low and the breeze was just right, Townsfolk swore they could see a faint figure in a flour-dusted apron walking past the bakery window, humming softly. And every loaf made in Ashton Hill, no matter who baked it, carried a faint warmth and sweetness unlike any other. Because love, once kneaded into the world, never truly disappears. It just rises, again